Subcommittee will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chair be authorized to declare recess during today's hearing. Without objections, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions. And without objection, so ordered. Good afternoon. I will start by recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to welcome everyone to today's hearings of the Railroad Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Subcommittee to learn more about the challenges facing commuter railroads. And before I begin, let me just say thank everyone for all the witnesses for being flexible with the cancellation of votes yesterday. We moved this hearing back, so thank you for your flexibility here. There's a lot going on right now on Capitol Hill, as we all know. But I think one thing people really are concerned about all the time is their local transportation. So we're here to learn more about the challenges facing commuter railroads. Since this committee has not held a hearing solely on commuter rail in a decade, I thought it was important to convene this hearing. After all, these railroads play a vital role in the daily lives of tens of millions of Americans. In 2017, 29 commuter railroads provided an estimated 510 million passenger trips. It is critical to remember that almost every person on commuter rail means one less car on our congested roads. And we certainly have a lot of congestion in the Chicago area. In addition to reducing traffic, reliable commuter rail also contributes to a cleaner environment and lower greenhouse gas emissions. Metra is Chicagoland's commuter rail agency, and I'm an occasional rider of Metra's busiest line, the BNSF. So I know personally both its benefits and frustrations. When Metra passengers get safe, reliable service, it's one of the best systems in the country. But like many legacy commuter railroads, Metra faces tight budgets year after year and has limited resources to address ongoing problems with old equipment and infrastructure that have created more and more headaches for riders. Today, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what we can do to minimize these headaches and give Americans reliable commuter rail service. The timing of this hearing is critical because as we begin to draft next year's reauthorization of surface transportation programs, we'll have an opportunity to address commuter rail funding concerns that we will hear about today. In the FAST Act, passenger rail was explicitly part of this reauthorization bill for the first time. It is a top priority of mine to do that again. I've heard from numerous stakeholders about the success of the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Program, known as CRISI, which was established in the FAST Act. And there's a desire to replicate such a program to provide dedicated federal funding for commuter railroads. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about the potential benefits of creating such a program. Another key funding issue for commuter railroads involves positive train control. I want to be clear that I and this committee fully expect all railroads to meet the 2020 deadline. As commuter rail agencies turn their attention to ensuring that PTC is maintained and functions as intended, I know that they are facing additional expenses. As a result, money has been taken from projected capital programs to cover these costs, and important projects to address the state of good repair backlog have been delayed or canceled. As service reauthorization moves forward, this area will be one the subcommittee will focus on. I hope to hear from Metrolink, who has been a leader in PTC implementation, and others on this panel about their PTC challenges. It is also imperative that commuter railroads have strong partnerships with freight railroads and Amtrak in order to provide reliable service. Unfortunately, in Chicago and other regions of the country, these partnerships are not always working as well as they should. Amtrak in particular has fallen short. At Chicago Union Station, which Amtrak owns, infrastructure failures have repeatedly caused serious delays and cancellations for Metra. Amtrak is also demanding that commuter railroads pay significantly more to use hubs like Chicago Union Station, 30th Street Station in Philadelphia, and Union Station here in DC. I've heard numerous questions raised about these increases and would like to hear more about this today. The relationship between commuter and freight railroads is better, but not without its own issues. As the demand for commuter rail grows, there's a need to expand service. But as any member who has been involved, but as a member and any other members who have been involved in discussions between commuter and freight railroads over service expansion, I can tell you is an arduous process that can take many years to add even a single additional train on some lines. While I'm understanding of the need to ensure freight operations aren't significantly impacted by additional commuter trains, the current process to work out service expansion can and should be better. Finally, I look forward to discussion about innovation and how Congress and USDOT can help advance research and deployment by commuter railroads of the latest technologies within the industry, like new technologies that help reduce rail grade crossing fatalities and trespassing death. The Federal Railroad Administration has a research and development program that receives around $35 million annually, and I'm interested in ideas from our witnesses on whether the program is functioning well and how we can improve on it in the upcoming surface reauthorization. This is the first hearing of the subcommittee as we begin to look at reauthorization of the FAST Act. I look forward to using this hearing and others this fall to look at important rail topics and working with my colleagues on practical solutions to the challenges ahead. And with that, I will now recognize Mr. Stauber, who is sitting in for Mr. Crawford as the ranking member, who is back home because he had some knee issues. Messed up his knee pretty badly last week, so fortunately, what I've heard, it's not as bad as he originally feared, and he will be back soon, I believe. But I will begin here by recognizing Mr. Stauber for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Lipinski, for holding this hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses for attending. Today, we are going to learn about some of the challenges and opportunities faced by our nation's commuter railroads. Commuter rail systems throughout the country provide critical access to our job centers and help relieve congestion on our roads. At the federal level, the Federal Transit Administration funds commuter rail transportation through formula funds and competitive grants. And the Federal Railroad Administration makes available discretionary grants, direct loans, and loan guarantees. State and local funding also is available. As this committee prepares to reauthorize surface transportation programs, it is critically important for commuter rail agencies to continue to look for ways to improve service while reducing costs. Several commuter rail agencies have implemented competitive contracting for commuter rail operations and other services as a way to provide the highest level of service at the lowest cost. Doing so ultimately drives increase in ridership and more mileage out of the taxpayer dollar. Thank you again to all our witnesses, and I look forward to our discussion. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
I would now like to welcome our panel of witnesses. Mr. Paul P. Kustelis, President and CEO of the American Public Transportation Association. Mr. Jim Derwinski, CEO and Executive Director of Metra. Mr. Peter Rogoff, CEO of Sound Transit. And Ms. Stephanie Wiggins, CEO of Metrolink. Thank you for being here today. I look forward to your testimony. Before we begin, and I'm going to give an additional opportunity to introduce a couple of the witnesses, I would also like to welcome a couple of other transportation leaders who are here, constituents of mine in the audience. Steve Palmer, who is here today with Mr. Derwinski, and he is a Metra board member. And also Rick Kwasniewski, who is chairman of the board of PACE, which is also a constituent of mine. So good to have have the two of you here today. Mr. Derwinski was selected as the next CEO, Executive Director of Metro Commuter Rail Agency by the Metro Board of Directors in August of 2017. In his role as Metro CEO and Executive Director, Jim has focused on making Metro more customer-friendly and service-oriented. Jim has a long career in Metro's mechanical department, most recently serving as its Chief Mechanical Officer. In that role, he oversaw 650 employees responsible for the repair, inspection, cleaning, and maintenance of nearly 1,200 rail cars and locomotives. He was also in charge of Metro's in-house rail car and locomotive rehabilitation programs, a contract for locomotive remanufacturing, and the installation of positive train control on cab cars and engines. After a 6-year stint in the U.S. Navy as an electrician on nuclear submarines, Jim began his railroad career as a locomotive electrician with the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad in 1993. He joined Metro as an electrician in 1997 and steadily rose through the ranks, serving as a foreman, general foreman, shop superintendent, director of systems maintenance, locomotive superintendent, Rock Island Division Director, and Milwaukee Division Director, and then Senior Director of Mechanical Operations. He was named Chief Mechanical Officer in September 2013. So Jim has a long history in railroads. Jim is a member of the American Public Transportation Association Board of Directors, along with serving on several other APTA committees. He is also on the Safety Operations and Management Committee of the Association of American Railroads and Transportation Technology Center Board of Directors. And I will now recognize Mr. Larson to introduce Mr. Peter Rogoff.
Thank you, Chair Lipinski, for inviting me to be here today and for calling this hearing on the importance of commuter rail in our nation's transportation system. I always say you can't have a big league economy with little league infrastructure, and robust federal transportation investment is critical to improving access to reliable commuting options and ensuring the safety of these systems, which is why I'm very pleased to introduce one of today's witnesses, Peter Rogoff, the CEO of Sound Transit. I've worked with Peter for many years to expand efficient commuter transit options for the Puget Sound region. His leadership and public service as the Federal Transit Administrator and Undersecretary of Transportation for Policy in the Obama administration were instrumental to improving transit service across the country, and he has, of course, since joined Sound Transit. Earlier this month, I joined Peter, local elected officials, and community members at the groundbreaking of the Linwood Link Extension Station in my district, Washington State's 2nd Congressional District. The Linwood Link Extension is a critical part of Sound Transit's efforts to build rail transit all the way from Tacoma through Seattle to Everett, my hometown. This project will help with traffic congestion and provide a reliable commuting option for up to 55,000 more daily riders throughout Northwest Washington. And last year, the FTA signed a $1.2 billion full funding grant agreement to get this project across the finish line. The expansion of safe, accessible, and efficient commuter transit nationwide must remain a priority. Peter's team at Sound Transit is part of that. I want to thank Peter for testifying here today. And with that, thank you for allowing me to participate, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Larson. Without objection, our witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. And since your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee requests that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. And with that, I will recognize Mr. Skoutelis.
Thank you. Chairman Lipinski, Ranking Member Crawford, Chairman DeFazio, Ranking Member Graves, Representative Babin, and members of the subcommittee, we thank you for the opportunity to testify today on commuter rail challenges and opportunities. I'm Paul Skoutelis, President and CEO of the American Public Transportation Association, also known as APTA. We represent 1,500 public and private sector organizations throughout North America, and we are the voice of public transportation modes for all of the modes of public transit, including commuter rail. Commuter rail today is a $10 billion industry which creates and supports over 200,000 jobs. The overwhelming majority of commuter rail funding, some 63%, flows through the public funding avenues to the private sector. Today, 32 agencies operating commuter rail safely carry more than 500 million passengers each year. Over the past decade, commuter rail ridership has grown by over 9%. For commuter rail operators and the entire public transportation industry, safety is a core value, a non-negotiable operating principle, and a promise to our riders. As a result, public transportation today is the safest form of surface transportation. In fact, traveling by commuter and intercity passenger rail is 18 times safer than traveling by car. Over the last few years, commuter railroads have been working to make commuter rail even safer by installing and implementing positive train control. And they're making great progress. 1/5 of all commuter rail agencies have fully implemented PTC, including Metrolink and Sound Transit. And of course, Metra is well on its way as well to fully meeting the deadlines by 2020. To date, the cost of full implementation of PTC is estimated to be approximately $4.1 billion for the commuter railroad agencies. And while we greatly appreciate Congress's support for commuter railroads by providing some federal funding for PTC implementation under the FAST Act and the CRISI grants, nearly 90% of PTC costs are being borne by state and local governments and agencies. Moreover, these very significant investments do not include the ongoing operating and maintenance costs associated with PTC implementation, which are currently estimated to be $160 million per year. APTA urges the committee to expand commuter rail eligibility under CRISI and to provide a total of $1 billion over 6 years, that's $160 million per year, specifically to provide grants to publicly funded commuter railroads to operate and maintain PTC. Although great progress has been made on PTC, many commuter rail agencies have had to defer other important infrastructure safety projects to focus on this mandate. For instance, highway rail grade crossing safety and trespassing remain significant issues. Over the last 5 years, 96% of railroad fatalities were attributable to trespassers or highway rail grade crossing users. We urge the committee to authorize a total of $1.5 billion over 6 years, that's $225 million per year, from CRISI grant funds to commuter and other passenger railroads for highway rail grade crossing safety initiatives. These funds would be in addition to the federal highway rail grade crossing set-aside, known as the Section 130 program. Federal investment in public transportation, including commuter rail, is an investment in America's jobs and economic competitiveness. The federal, state, and local partnership remains essential to ensuring that critical infrastructure investments are made. Commuter rail receives funding from 3 separate federal sources: urbanized formula area grants, state of good repair grants, and the capital investment grants known as CIG. The economic benefits of investing in commuter rail are wide-ranging. In addition to the critical local economic benefits of these projects, there are vehicles, parts, supplies that are made all over America and across the nation that really do contribute to the economy. In the next surface transportation bill, APTA strongly urges the committee to continue that federal partnership by investing $145 billion over 6 years in public transportation to fund critical projects that will repair, maintain, and improve our public transit systems, including commuter rail, both today and well into the future. Our proposal would address the entire state of good repair backlog, would fund all the CIG projects in the pipeline for the next 6-year period. Finally, given the critical need for investment in public transportation, we're deeply concerned about proposed cuts to public transportation funding in the Senate's fiscal year 2020 Transportation Appropriations, or the THUD bill. The bill cuts CIG funding by $575 million and state of good repair grants by another $178 million. These cuts would directly impact investment in new commuter rail projects and limit the ability of public transit systems, including commuter rail, to address state of good repair needs. We strongly urge the committee to work with us to restore these critical investments for public transportation in conference with the Senate. And this year is critically important. The final FY 2020 THUD funding levels will reset the budget baseline as you begin developing the next Surface Transportation Authorization Act. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to testify and share our thoughts on commuter rail. We certainly look forward to working with the committee as it writes the Surface Transportation Authorization Act. I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Skutelis. I now recognize Mr. Dwinski for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Lipinski, Ranking Member Crawford, members of this esteemed committee. My name is Jim Derwinski, Executive Director and CEO of Metra in Chicago. In addition, I also represent APTA on their Board of Directors and the Commuter Rail CEO Subcommittee, and I'm also Chairman of the recently formed Commuter Rail Coalition. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to be here today. Let me first begin by commending leadership of Chairman Lipinski and Congressman Garcia that have brought in advancing transportation infrastructure needs in our region and in the nation. On behalf of Metra and its 280,000 daily commuters, we thank you for all that you do for us. Broadly, Metra and commuter rail industry face two major challenges: a lack of sustainable, consistent federal funding for operations and capital projects, and constraints on our ability to grow. Throughout the United States, commuter rail systems receive a combination of federal, state, and local government funds. Not all receive federal. Metra was created in 1983 by the Illinois General Assembly, and since then has invested over $6 billion into our network. Yet, our own Regional Transportation Association estimates we will still need to spend $1.2 billion a year over the next 10 years just to achieve and maintain a state of good repair. Growth is not in that equation. Our estimate to complete PTC installation will cost Metra over $400 million, which equates currently to 2.5 years of our federal formula funding. It also will put a burden on our operating expenses of $20 million annually. All commuter railroads have the same ongoing operating costs, as Mr. Costello has pointed out. I wanted to take the opportunity to thank Congress and the FRA for allowing commuter railroads, including Metra, to utilize the Christie Grant Program for PTC projects. However, this source of funding is not sustainable, and we strongly believe more needs to be done by Congress. Creating a new dedicated commuter rail grant program would provide some relief to public agencies to address PTC operations and maintenance costs and associated capital costs. It would also help to ensure that many commuter rail systems across the country are no longer forced to rely on sporadic discretionary grants and can effectively plan for both safety and capital expenditures. Our second major challenge has been the constrained growth of our system in the face of increased demand. Recent studies have shown that more than 80% of the U.S. population lives in urban areas. That's up from 64% in 1950. The number is projected to grow to 90% by 2050. This rapid pace of change in the commuter rail industry reflects these facts. For example, when Congress created Amtrak in 1970, there was one public commuter rail agency. As Mr. Costello just pointed out, today there are 32. This rapid growth has placed an incredible demand on the railroad infrastructure capacity. The convenience and necessity of moving people and passenger trains can create friction with our freight rail partners and Amtrak. These issues are particularly acute in high-density areas. These situations can cause tension and unfortunate delays for both commuter, intercity passenger, and freight. Commuter rail desires a relationship with Amtrak that is fair and transparent. In 2016, the GAO conducted a study to review Amtrak's efforts to reorganize and reform. The report found that several material weaknesses and significant deficiencies have hindered Amtrak's ability to create consistent and timely accounting documents and financial information. Amtrak's accounting and transparency issues have led to challenges in commuter railroad relationships. We encourage this committee to implement the GAO's report recommendation. Lastly, despite the intention of past Congresses to give preference to passenger trains over freight, recently the concept of public convenience and necessity has been focused on the interests of freight railroads and their customers, and less on the interest of publicly funded commuter railroads. Under federal law, certain preferences have been given to Amtrak. However, those preferences have not been extended to the publicly funded commuter railroads, even though many, in case, run on the same tracks with Amtrak and the freight railroads. This chamber has already begun to consider these types of issues in a thoughtful manner. Chairman Lipinski constructively worked with the appropriations in 2020 THUD bill to improve on-time performance in Chicago. Metra is proud that we have maintained a 93% or higher on-time performance since 1983. To be clear, Metra and the 13 freight railroads in Chicago work closely daily to move passengers and goods through the most complicated network in the country. Our freight partners demonstrate their commitment to this vital public asset daily. We also applaud the chairman and this committee's leadership on the CREATE program. It continues to be a positive example of federal government, rail operators, and local and state governments coming together to tackle major challenges like Chicago's congested rail network. Increasing investment in programs like CREATE are clear solutions to relieving congestion on railroad infrastructure that benefit all rail operators, public and private, by increasing movement of trains, not increasing the parking of trains in communities. Metra thanks Congress for its continued support of public transportation systems like ours and appreciates the opportunity to update this committee on our challenges, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rogoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Representatives Babin, Weber, members of the subcommittee. Sound Transit provides commuter rail, light rail, and express bus service throughout our three-county region, which includes some 51 cities, including Seattle, Tacoma, and Everett. The unprecedented population growth in our region has caused highway congestion to more than double in just the last 6 years. As such, our voters in 2016 approved and funded a $54 billion ballot measure, which, when combined with our prior ballot measures, has launched us into the largest transit expansion program in the United States. I'm going to focus my remarks this afternoon on the challenges we face in expanding commuter rail, specifically expanding our busiest Sounder South route, which has grown more than 30% just since 2014. The line is an extraordinarily great value, especially for the riders of Pierce County and cities like Lakewood, Tacoma, Sumner, Puyallup, and Auburn, who for just about $5 can bypass the punishing congestion that is a daily occurrence on State Route 167, Interstate 405, and I-5. The challenges we face in expanding Sounder commuter rail directly relate to many of the unique challenges that the commuter rail industry faces writ large, which you're hearing about from my colleagues. Unlike our expanding light rail system, which we build and control ourselves, on Sounder we run along BNSF's main line, which also serves the ports of Seattle and Tacoma. Together, these two ports represent the nation's second largest gateway to Asia. So we have one long segment of mainline track that must accommodate freight trains to these busy ports, Sound Transit commuter trains, state-funded Amtrak trains, federally funded Amtrak trains, and military deliveries to Joint Base Lewis McChord. We are trying to do a great deal over very constrained infrastructure. This is not a unique challenge for commuter railroads, but it may be especially acute in our region. It certainly presents challenges when we, the commuter railroad, are trying to deliver our passengers to their destination on time. As a transit provider, our service is only desirable if it's reliable. And nothing undermines the reliability of our Sounder trains more than interference with Amtrak or freight trains that are not running on time. It is in this congested environment in which we are now challenged to introduce additional commuter rail service to meet growing demand. Commuter rail is an expensive enterprise because of the operating and capital costs inherent in putting the service on the street every day. Unlike our light rail systems, for commuter rail, we must negotiate for track access with BNSF, paying millions for each track easement. That said, the return on investment for commuter rail is tremendous for the working families who ride it. With our rapidly growing regional economy, to the extent that there is affordable housing to be found anywhere in our region, it is to be found in cities like Everett and Tacoma and the cities in East Pierce County that are served by Sounder commuter rail. As is the case for many growing cities around the country, it is not just middle-class families that are being pushed to the suburbs. The transit-dependent working poor are also being pushed farther and farther out of town in search of affordable housing. And we, as the federally funded regional transit agency, are both obliged and determined to serve them. Adequate federal funding and streamlined federal processes are essential in helping us to do so. When it comes to federal funding, the taxpayers of the Puget Sound region are already financing 84% of our overall system expansion, but we rely on federal partnerships to finance the remainder. As such, we strongly support the expansion of federal programs that help us meet the demands of our passengers. We participate in the Federal Transit Administration's Capital Investment Grants Program and look forward to applying in the next few weeks under the FRA's CRISI program. Going forward, as we expand our Sounder commuter rail service, we're very interested in investigating a partnership with the FTA's Core Capacity Program, perhaps combining our local taxpayer investments with a combination of FTA Core Capacity funds and an FRA RIF loan. Sound Transit is also the nation's largest TIFIA borrower. We are the only recipient to date of a TIFIA Master Credit Agreement. TIFIA has been an incredibly powerful tool in helping us borrow funds affordably to deliver improved service to our region. In the years I worked for the federal government, both in Congress at the US DOT, I've had the privilege of having some level of involvement in each of the surface transit reauthorization bills going back to ICE-T in 1990. I've included in my written testimony 10 concrete recommendations that I would encourage you to consider for the next one. These recommendations are all about streamlining and harmonizing federal programs and processes to make them more effective and less bureaucratic, so we and our federal partners could get improved service to our taxpayers more quickly. MAP 21 and the FAST Act made good progress in these areas. More remains to be done. So thank you for holding this hearing today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And finally, Recognize Ms. Wiggins for 5 minutes.
Thank you. They warned me about that. Sorry about that. Good afternoon, Chairman Lipinski, Congressman Bayman, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel to discuss the challenges and opportunities facing our nation's commuter railroads. I am Stephanie Wiggins, and I assumed the Chief Executive Officer position at Metrolink in January 2019. Since then, I have been focused on how our rail service can help improve the lives of the 21 million people in Southern California. A detailed written testimony has been submitted. I would like to highlight a few points. Metrolink began operating in 1992 with the idea to serve Southern California. Today, Metrolink is literally and figuratively connecting Southern California communities and even into the northern portion of San Diego County. This is a vast 538 route mile network. Last fiscal year, a record 11.9 million trips were taken on Metrolink, the highest in our 26-year history. This is equivalent to removing 9.3 million vehicles from our congested Southern California roads. Even more significant, this is the 5th consecutive year we've seen growth in ridership. Commuter railroads give people more freedom, more connections to economic opportunity, and more time. In an era of escalating housing costs around the country, commuter railroads allow Americans to avoid having to choose between where they live and where they work. Riders avoid the stress associated with sitting in traffic for hours each day. We enable them to make a more environmentally friendly decision and to choose an overall healthier lifestyle. Why is commuter rail important? Southern California is notorious for soul-crushing traffic 24/7, and Metrolink is the alternative. Even half of our staff take it to work every day. My goal is to leverage our recent successes and unlock the great potential of Metrolink to double the ridership in the next 5 years. We want to be the premier regional rail system by the time Southern California and the nation are on the world stage again for the 2028 Olympic and Paralympic Games. Some 300 passenger and freight trains are dispatched on the Metrolink network every day. That's more than 50,000 trains each year. The freight trains carry the cargo that drives our economy, like shipments to and from the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, which together serve as the entry point for 40% of the nation's goods. None of this would be possible without ensuring safety is at the core of what we do. Metrolink is proud to be one of the 4 railroads in the country to have PTC installed and fully interoperable by the congressionally mandated deadline. To acknowledge and appreciate this milestone, Metrolink hosted a Rail Safety Summit as part of California's Rail Safety Month. We were honored to have National Transportation Safety Board member Jennifer Hamady as our keynote speaker. Since this week is National Safety Week, I would be remiss if I did not highlight other safety initiatives on which Metrolink has sought to lead the way. We installed precursor technologies to PTC. We installed inward and outward-facing cameras on locomotives and cab cars a decade prior to the proposed rules by the FRA. And we've designed crash energy management into our newest rolling stock. We will continue to operate with safety as our core value. Another part of the vision is to have a zero-incident railroad for grade crossing and trespasser strikes. The large geographic region serviced by Metrolink includes inner-city passenger and freight rail that are all growing. And with 456 at-grade crossings in the network, these are the most common interface points with railroads and often the most precarious. And we must also ensure our infrastructure is in a state of good repair and our facilities and customer-facing technologies all provide the type of experience that will keep our customers coming back and will entice new riders. To do so, we need your help. Our state and region have stepped up to provide significant funding for infrastructure over the next decade. To make the best use of these funds, we need to leverage federal dollars. With that in mind, we have the following requests. Provide full eligibility to commuter rail for FRA-administered discretionary programs. Provide substantially more funding for critical railroad crossing and right-of-way improvements. And include dedicated new funding for commuter rail that does not supplant existing funding sources. I thank you again for the opportunity to speak to the subcommittee today, and I look forward to today's dialogue.
Thank you, Ms. Wiggins. Now I'm going to recognize members for 5 minutes of question time, and I'm going to begin by recognizing Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes. Mr. Garcia?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Crawford for hosting this hearing on the challenges our commuter rail systems are facing. I especially want to thank, of course, Mr. Jim Derwinski, CEO of Metra in Illinois, the largest commuter rail system in the U.S. That's no small job, and I'm thankful that you could join us today. And I want to thank all the panelists, of course. Jim was so kind as to take 2 hours of his busy day this past March to personally give my staff and I a tour of a major Metra locomotive rehabilitation facility. So I thank you for your leadership, Jim. My district hugs the Chicago downtown area. It serves as that sweet spot served by both CTA train system and by a Metra system. In fact, there are at least 5 major commuter rail lines that run through my district, the 4th Congressional District, about 15 Metra stations. The BNSF to Aurora, Union Pacific Northwest to McHenry, Milwaukee District North to Fox Lake, North Central Service to Antioch, and Union Pacific West to Elborn. These lines run through the communities of Cicero, Berwyn, Riverside, Brookfield, Berkeley, Melrose Park, Elmwood Park, and the northwest side of Chicago, including Logan Square and Humboldt Park, all of which I represent. As Chairman Lipinski and Metra CEO Jim Derwinski noted, commuter rail is an essential component of what makes Chicago run by connecting people to jobs and taking cars off the congested roads. But Metra and our commuter rail systems face significant challenges. Ridership has gone up 23% since the year 2000, yet, as I understand it, commuter rail systems continue to face significant restraints on growth and continue to struggle with uncertain and inadequate funding streams. So I'd like to ask some questions. Mr. Derwinski, we have challenges relating to affordable housing and urban sprawl in Chicago. Smart planning and transit-oriented development are vital to ensuring that we are building diverse, affordable, and inclusive communities, and that Metra plays a key role in connecting our communities to jobs and educational opportunities. So my question is, how can Congress support Metra and commuter railroads in the upcoming FAST Act reauthorization, especially in regards to helping urban areas plan sustainable communities?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. Clearly, as all of my colleagues have pointed out today, commuter rail plays an integral part of all communities that they serve. As Congress looks toward the reauthorization of the FAST Act, increased dedicated funding to commuter is exactly what's needed. I believe we can show on a normal basis that the return on investment is immense. Where we go, the community really grows. You talk about the transit-oriented developments. They're occurring all over the place, and a lot of them are occurring naturally. It's just building around the train station, and that's what people want to be able to do. They want to live where they want to live, but they know where they have to work, and the commuter is that one way to get there. As other colleagues talk about, congestion on the West Coast is horrible. It's no different in Chicago. It may just not last 24 hours. So I think increased funding is what we need.
And does a dedicated funding stream or expanded eligibility for existing discretionary grants have a role in the solution?
Absolutely. We definitely need that type of, the competitive system right now doesn't really work for us because as we've grown from one publicly funded commuter railroad to now 32, there's such a big demand out there, and the competitive system doesn't work. We need some dedicated funding.
Okay, let's talk about safety briefly. I know both commuter and freight have diligently worked to implement positive train control, PTC, by 2020 deadline. I share the views of my counterpart in the Senate, Ranking Member Duckworth, that PTC is not implemented until every stakeholder is fully implemented, interoperability being the key. On July 31st, a few weeks ago, you testified before the Senate about the ongoing financial and technological challenges of completing interoperability in major urban areas like Chicago. Can you comment on any ongoing challenges there have been with technology companies working on interoperability like WebTech and implementing the full PTC?
Yes, I can. And I thank the Senate for inviting me to testify there. As I checked on PTC status even this week, I've heard, and I'll use their terms, there's an army of people from WabTech right now currently serving Chicago. So the message got through to WabTech. They are certainly helping. But the challenges for interoperability are still in front of us. As we begin testing with all the 13 railroads we're going to have to test with in Chicago, it's time, and it's eventually sometimes software patches. But currently, right now, WabTech has increased their manpower in Chicago, and it's really trying to help us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I yield back.
You recognize Mr. Babin for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we appreciate the witnesses coming today. Thank you all for being here. A question for all of you. In the implementation process of positive train control mandate, have you experienced or do you see concerns with interoperability? If we'll go to you first, Mr. Skoutelas.
Sure, thank you. Yes, indeed. As we've had our many meetings and technical workshops over the past couple of years, there's no doubt that the complexity of installing positive train control really comes down to the final stages, which means the interoperability between the railroads and how they operate their various systems. They need to be able to talk to one another, and that's where you're putting together different systems, different technologies, and protocols that need to be adapted. So it has been one of the challenges that our commuter rail agencies have faced. They're working through it. There's great progress being made, but there's no question it remains a challenge as they look to complete this by the 2020 deadline.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Derwinski.
Yeah, in Chicago here, Metro is not yet interoperable with any of its freight partners. However, next month, October, we'll be testing with 5 of those railroads, and we have plans to finish up those 5 railroads by the end of the year, beginning to work with the other railroads in the beginning of the year. The good news is that the technologies that we're using and the software we're using were already developed and refined in LA, and so we believe that there'll just be some refinements in Chicago.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rogoff.
I would just add, we at Sound Transit were up and running fully on PTC in October of 2018, ahead of the 2019 deadline. But we had multiple railroads, obviously, as I said earlier, running on one main line, and not everyone was at the same level of development. Amtrak was progressing at one pace. BNSF and we, and for that matter, Tacoma Rail was progressing on another. I will say this. I think Administrator Batory at the FRA did a good job as we were approaching that deadline of convening all the commuter railroads and having us not suffer in silence as we were all trying to figure out these implementation challenges, but actually learning from each other on what the industry-wide challenges were and helping us work through those. But that is going to be one of the challenges, is when you put a mandate of multiple railroads sharing the same track, getting them all to progress at precisely the same pace just doesn't always come together.
Okay. And then Ms. Wiggins, real quickly, if you don't mind.
Yes, it was very complex and difficult, but interoperability was achieved, principally because our Class 1 partners, BNSF and UP, along with Amtrak and Coaster, we all got in the room together and figured it out.
Excellent, thank you. Many commuter agencies across the country now contract for services including operations and maintenance. Certainly Amtrak is one competitor, but there are many others. And what are your thoughts on both your current experience working with contractors and the future of competition between private providers in the commuter area, commuter arena? I'm sorry, I apologize. Mr. Skoutelas.
Well, what we find in the commuter rail arena, but we also find it in other modes of transit as well, particularly on the bus side, but even light rail. There's a mix. Certainly our agencies, I believe, are really looking at what makes the most sense for their local circumstances, the requirements that they have to operate. But we've seen with many of the new commuter rail lines that have opened up in the past decade, they're privately contracted by choice by the agencies. And I think that's the right approach. In every circumstance, not one solution or approach is going to be the correct one. It has to be adaptable to what makes sense locally, and that's what we're seeing really in our experience in looking at the agencies and how they're approaching this issue.
And one more question for you, if you don't mind, sir. How would you balance the funding needs of our highway network with the needs of commuter agencies?
Well, we have a very robust and comprehensive authorization proposal that our association has been working on for the past 18 months. We think it's critically important that the issue of the Highway Trust Fund solvency be addressed. Obviously, the FAST Act expires at the end of September of next year. We have a detailed set of proposals that move forward with the highway mode, because we think it's important to address surface transportation together, not separately. And so our proposal moves in that fashion. We're part of a unified approach that our coalition partners, including AASHTO and ARPTA and the U.S. Chamber, all support, and that is, for our purposes, increasing the gasoline tax in the medium term. That would raise more money not only for highways but for public transit as well. And we have other proposals as well that go into the fine details of how we would accomplish that, and we'd be happy to share that detail with this committee at any time.
Great, and I've run out of time, Mr. Chairman, so I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair will now recognize Ms. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this important meeting, and I welcome Ms. Stephanie Wiggins, the new CEO of Metrolink, to testify, and I'm glad to see you. It's a major transportation provider for residents and businesses in my district. It has 2 routes, San Bernardino Riverside, 4 stations, and El Monte, Baldwin Park, Covina, and Industry, and I am very pleased the board appointed Ms. Wiggins last December as the new CEO. Long track record of effective transportation leadership in Southern California, having worked for 3 to 5 of the Metrolink member agencies, including San Bernardino County Transportation Authority, Riverside County Transportation Authority, and most recently, Deputy CEO at LA Metro. We need more women in transportation, ma'am. I read your testimony with much interest, and you briefly discussed innovative technologies in grade crossing safety and requests that Congress and FRA support such programs. I am concerned with the suicides and pedestrian accidents on the railroad, and also the homeless situation in the area. Could you expound a little on that?
Sure. One of the challenges of operating a system that covers over 500 route miles is that we also have over 400 at-grade crossings in the network. And it's not just Metrolink operating. As I shared in my testimony, we have the freight railroads operating, Amtrak operating, so it's 300 trains a day. And we're operating through communities. And so this issue of trespasser strikes and grade crossing conflicts is of deep concern to all of us in the industry. It was reiterated by FRA's report just last fall. While every area is unique geographically, we have been challenged with homeless encampments in some of our right-of-way, rail right-of-way, that have contributed to trespasser strikes. And then generally, I think all of us would attest to just pedestrian distraction, right? So we are working, looking at innovative technologies. We're working with Operation Lifesaver. We are working with the vendor community to come up with different ways to help educate people to stay off the tracks, but also looking at engineering and law enforcement resources. Inevitably, though, it goes down to what the FRA report highlighted. There's not enough funding to address the needs, and we're just 456. I'm sure my colleagues can talk about more, but we know that grade separations make a difference, and additional federal funding would be needed.
Well, I know the quad gates are rather expensive, because I know several of my cities wanted to put them in, and they shuddered when they saw the price on them. The Operation Lifesaver, is it still volunteer?
I'm sorry, Congressman, I didn't hear the question.
Lifesaver. The Operation Lifesaver is still a volunteer operation for employees?
Yes, it is.
And there's any funding for that so they can get more information out to the general public?
We would appreciate and support additional funding for Operation Lifesaver. We were fortunate to just receive a grant, again, to help with education and outreach on railroads crossing safety. But yes, Operation Lifesaver is a voluntary nonprofit organization that seeks to partner with railroads across the country for safety.
Well, those are very important things in my area. The other area that our region both benefits from and is burdened by the private and public railroads sharing the same rail lines. What is the current state of your relationship with the freight railroads?
We are fortunate in Southern California to have a positive relationship with the freight railroads. 48% of our network is made possible because we share the corridor with the Class 1 railroads. While just as with any family, there can be challenges at times, the opportunities are we're able to add more frequency of service. We're able to, when our goals align, advocate for additional funding, both at the state level and the local level.
Well, if you have increased ridership, will that interfere with the railroads doing their job?
I think the challenge is that we're all trying to grow, but I'm fortunate that our railroad partners, particularly right now, BNSF and Metrolink, are talking about how we can jointly grow and not conflict with each other. Fundamentally, that means identifying the capital projects that are needed and the federal funding that's needed to help support them.
Well, congratulations on getting the work done on the train control. That is very important. I think we did an extension. I think we're going to do another one. Thank you very much, Ms. Chair.
Chair will now recognize Mr. Weber for 5 minutes.
Is that all? Thank you, Mr. Chair. I came in a little late, so I missed some of the first part of your presentation, but I do have some questions. I want to follow up Brian Babin's question about working with freight trains. I think, Mr. Rogoff, you answered it, but I don't think everybody else answered that, or did I miss that? Let's start with you, Mr. Castells. Are y'all seeing a lot of cooperation between the freight and the passenger trains?
We are. We're seeing a great deal of cooperation. Let's understand that obviously they're competing interests. On the one hand, the freights need to move goods and make their revenue targets and such. Our railroads need to move passengers, and therein lies the challenge that we have. But I think if you heard from my colleagues here, there's a great deal of cooperation that goes on day to day to make sure that we're doing the very best from the passenger railroad side to be able to get the time that we need and the trackage to operate the service. Certainly in the best of ideal worlds, I think everybody here would probably say, if I had my own dedicated right-of-way, my own track, we would be better off. But that's not
How about
the
a
world we
two-way
live in.
highway? Would that be better, 2 tracks on the same path? You know, where you had like cars, where you had one going this way, one coming back? That would require an expanded right-of-way, obviously, but boy, that'd be ideal, wouldn't it?
Sure. In some instances, that might be possible, given the right-of-way. In others, it's not, because of the limitations of geometry and the land that you have available to it. But I think, again, our experiences in working very closely with our commuter rail agencies is they do an incredible job of balancing those needs and making sure that they're doing the very, very best they can to deliver
Thank you. I'm going to jump down to Ms. Wiggins. I'm going to go out of turn here. I was fascinated. You said that Southern California is notorious for soul-crushing traffic. Is that what you said?
Yes, sir.
Not soul-crashing, but soul-crushing traffic.
That's correct.
Okay. 456 at-grade crossings in the network. Is your only partner, you said you've been partnered, 41% of the railroad is shared, and then you mentioned BNSF. Is that the only rail line that's there?
No, thank you for allowing me to clarify. It's BNSF, but also Union Pacific Railroad.
Just those 2?
Yes, those 2.
Do you know what percentage of those?
Not offhand, but I can get you the
Okay.
information.
I'm getting my expert over here saying major percentage. So thank you for that, Ms. Napolitano. Mr. Derwinski, is that how you say that?
Yes, sir.
You said you didn't have a lot of freight interoperability, if I remember your comments. Is that correct?
As far as the PTC interoperability,
Right.
we're working with the freights right now to start that process next month.
Do you have a date?
Next month, we intend to start 5 of the railroads that we're going to be interoperable with and be finished with that interoperability testing by the end of this year.
By the testing by the end of this year, but how about operability?
Well, and then after you finish the testing, then you are certified interoperable, yes.
Okay. All right, well, thank you for that. Let me go to stay with you for Mr. Derwinski. You referenced the 2016 GAO report on Amtrak's implementation of PRIA. Have you noticed an improvement in that accounting transparency since enactment of the FAST Act?
Not really. We've been obviously working with Amtrak on negotiations at Chicago Union Station, and transparency has been one of the key topics. We just want to do for the Illinois taxpayers the right thing, and it's just making sure we're paying the bills we should pay.
Well, you have the camera and the microphone right now, so what recommendations do you have to improve Amtrak's accountings?
Well, I would say, once again, the GAO report had recommendations. I would ask this committee to help Amtrak enforce those recommendations for transparency.
None that you care to highlight?
Specifically, just once
Just
again,
what's in
it's,
the report? Okay.
Sir, I think the big thing is when we talk with Amtrak, there's line items that have a lot of vagueness in it. And then when you question into those line items without getting very specific, you find out maybe there's bills from other parts of the country.
Okay,
And that's what
fair
we're
enough.
looking
I want to jump over to Mr. Rogoff now, if I may. Given your experience in the administration, both at FTA and OST, can you explain the benefits of streamlining project delivery? What are some of the areas you would recommend for further streamlining?
Well, thank you for the question. I have, like I said, 10 specific recommendations in my testimony, but I think as a transit provider, one of the frustrations we have is our expanded service, by definition, is environmentally beneficial. So it can be a frustration when the quote-unquote environmental process is the thing that slows us down. And I think it'd be
It's
worthy.
kind of an antithesis, isn't it?
A little bit, but part of that is just about consulting with communities, and we want to consult fully with communities. But there are some things, that we're putting there. We've got 2 different requirements, for example, on how we comply with looking out for historic preservation, one under Section 106, one under 4F. Surely those can be harmonized. I think one of the important things I noted in my testimony is there seems to be a drive in Congress to get agencies to act more quickly on environmental permits, and we agree with that. At the same time, the staff ranks of those agencies has been allowed to diminish. And I'm not sure it's reasonable to think that we can get faster action out of agencies, I used to head one of these agencies, and still expect them to be able to do it with smaller and smaller staffs. So I think there really should be some ground up looking at, do they have the staffing complement they need to engage with us early and issue permits early?
Okay, thank you for that. I'm out of time. I appreciate you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I will now recognize myself, while I'm pondering, recognize myself for 10 minutes to do start a second round in the second 5 minutes. So if I can do that, I'll do that, or else we'll see what the transcript says. So I want to make sure my colleagues had a chance to ask questions, and a lot of good questions there. I sort of feel like I've go through this a lot, and I've gone through this with Mr. Dewinski and others at Metra. I talked about the one line, that the BNSF line, that I will take when I'm going into downtown Chicago. Here are a few of the things that have happened in the last couple years that have caused major disruptions. Train derailed coming out of the yard, blocking multiple tracks at Union Station. A computer problem, which we won't get into, that Amtrak mistake caused, that shut down all signals for 3 rush hours. A freight train dragging utility poles across the tracks and blocking the tracks. More than once, broken rails from the cold. That's just a few of the things that have caused major disruptions. There's falling concrete at Chicago Union Station that cause issues. There are a lot of problems out there, and I think there's a lot more help that some of this we can help with here in providing more funding for commuter rail. Commuter rail is certainly, it's growing very, very fast. And I think more than other forms of public transportation, though I think we need to support all of them more. But I want to start out by asking, we've talked a little bit about Amtrak here. And this is not an easy question, but I'm going to throw it out there. So what would you like to see Congress do when it comes to your ability to deal with Amtrak? Mr. Dewinski, you started talking about some of the issues that you're having about Chicago Union Station. There's other issues with Amtrak. There's a Heritage Corridor line that Metra has that only has 7 trains total during a day. The demand is great. There's an issue with that I've tried to get cross honor of tickets between Metra and Amtrak, and so that it provides a little more service locally, but on Amtrak, and that has not been worked out. So let me start with you, Mr. Drwinski. What would you like Congress to do that would help you in your negotiations and your work with Amtrak?
Well, specifically, sir, on the Chicago Union Station, right now we're in the STB with Amtrak trying to work out an access agreement, but it's been a struggle. We're 89% of the train movements in Union Station, yet we have really no say at the table. So it's been, nothing's for sale per Amtrak. We understand that. What we're looking for is a partnership where there's the responsible parties can actually meet each other at a table on a normal basis and try to work out problems. Now, I'm going to say very clearly, on a day-to-day basis, the local people on the ground do deal with all these problems that you discussed. Some of those problems were major. They really affected tens of thousands of people. And there are minor problems that happen on a normal basis. And the local people, Metra, Amtrak, BNSF, they're all working together to make that stuff happen. As far as the growth goes, the Heritage Corridor line that you brought up, the real problem with the Heritage Corridor line is Metra can't really provide extra service out there because of the 6 freight tracks we have to cross at grade. It's just the infrastructure of the system right now. Once again, create projects that would actually start elevating one railroad over another railroad and start creating these super highways for passenger trains is really what needs to start being looked at within.
All right, we'll get more to that. I want to see if anyone else has anything to say about Amtrak. Mr. Rogoff?
I think it's important to note that, both Mr. Drwinski and I, we have very similar on-time performance levels. When things work well, they work very, very well. But when they work poorly, as in the instances that you pointed out, Mr. Chairman, things go really badly, really quickly, and a lot of commuters are delayed. One of the things that goes wrong is when Amtrak isn't running on time. Amtrak being an interstate operator, when they, for example, send Coast Starlight trains into the state of Washington, they may already be hours late having left California and Oregon. Getting Amtrak to run on time helps us run on time. Also, if they arrive late, BNSF has to, through its dispatching method, still get them through the system. And that not only clogs up BNSF's movements, they clog up our passenger movements. There's been a serious deterioration of on-time performance of Amtrak trains, and I think the committee should well look at that in terms and see if their priority that has been granted them in the law for operating over freight right-of-way is really being honored. Anything that would help them move on more on time would help the rest of us that share the track.
And Ms. Wiggins or Mr. Gutellus, anything to add? You don't need to, but okay. I will, did you have something, Ms. Wiggins? Okay. I want to be clear. I want Amtrak to work well. I am fully supportive of Amtrak and Amtrak service. But I think there are some issues here that obviously have been mentioned. I want to move on to working with the freight railroads. Again, I'm looking for anything that anyone would recommend that they would like to see Congress do when it comes to commuter railroads' ability to work with the freight railroads. Does anyone have any suggestions on that?
I'll take that first. As I said earlier when I was talking about the heritage, that's one of the problems with Chicago. All the freight trains that we have to work with, 700 freight trains a day, with 700 passenger trains a day on the same network, when they cross at grade, when it's like a stop sign. It's not a stoplight, it's a stop sign. And when the fast car goes through, the passenger train, 20 feet long, it has to then wait sometimes for up to almost a 2.5-mile freight train. So separating these two elements inside this tight urban network is challenging. Adding extra lanes of traffic isn't always an option just because land isn't available. So really it's about separating these things. Eventually, it's also about how the trains integrate with each other. As Mr. Rogoff pointed out, that sometimes happens it actually happens all the time. A freight train's out of pocket, a passenger train's out of pocket, and that throws off these heavy, dense rush hours. Now, for the most part, freights work with us inside our rush hours, And that's where, obviously, the domino effect can really, really hinder us.
Do you want to talk at all about issues in Lake County?
In Lake County, we're stagnated on growth right now. We just had recently an opportunity to look at a reverse commute market. It's up and running, but our ability right now to add an extra train was basically a no. The current infrastructure right now, the owner says no. So we did have basically a little bit of a frustration there where we're trying to grow the system, we're trying to take care of our operating needs, but we're hindered on that.
All right, Mr. Rogoff.
Well, I would just say, in all of our conversations with BNSF are always collaborative, cooperative, but also expensive ones. And I say that they're expensive is when we want to introduce additional frequencies to meet passenger demand. The test for BNSF is what infrastructure investments will we make, the general taxpayer, to their railroad to help eliminate the likelihood that our trains are going to intersect. And that's to make sure that freight movements can serve the ports and also serve us. I think Congress can take a position that recognizes that a robust and functional freight network is inherently beneficial even though they're privately held, especially if we're talking about climate change, especially if we're talking about decongestion and what we can do to keep both trucks moving on the highway but freight moving across the country. At this current juncture, it is all on us, Sound Transit, to make the investments to deconflict our commuter trains with the freight trains. We could get federal grants for that, but I also believe that there may be a way of getting into the funding mix, a conversation of how we can make our freight network more hospitable to all, both them and us.
Thank you. Any other comments on that one? I will then move on. I did start at 10 minutes, correct? All right, I just want to make sure I've been going that long. Let me just, I asked those questions. Those are more difficult questions because I think we've covered a lot of the important issues here. The cost of PTC, and we need to have PTC, the mandate's in place. We're going to hold everyone to that. But I think you've all made clear how much that's going to cost, and that comes at the expense of other capital projects. Mr. Skatelis had talked about $1 billion for PTC, I believe, over 6 years, $1.5 billion for grade crossing safety and Christie, in addition to Section 130. I think that is also critical, grade crossing safety. I would probably would want more than that. I think there are things, grade separations can be very expensive, but those are really the most safe ways to go. And in general, increasing the amount that we give for public transit. But I think it's important in this hearing that, like I said, I wanted to have this hearing because it's been a decade since we had a hearing solely on commuter rail. And it's becoming more and more important in so many communities across the country. And I think it's important that this committee and the subcommittee focus on what can be done for commuter rail, for all the reasons that you have talked about here. So I appreciate very much all your testimony, and I think I owe it to, I'm going to yield back, and I'm going to owe it to Mr. Weber. I'll give you 5 minutes if you want to ask any more questions. All right, so thank you, Mr. Weber. I want to thank all of our witnesses as I go and look for my script so I say all the right things here at the end that I need to say.
Do I need to take those 5 minutes?
No, that's all right. I want to thank all of our witnesses for your testimony. As I said, this is an issue that I've spent many hours going through issues with commuter rail in the Chicago area, and I not only ride it, I hear from my constituents about it often. Every time there's an issue, I hear from members of my family when there are issues. But I think it's critically important, especially as we're looking at what are we going to do to get cars off the road. Southern California, talk about the congestion there, but I'll give you Chicago's congestion, put it up against that any day. And critical also for our environment. I think, and I think we really need in this reauthorization of the FAST Act to seriously not just consider, but put the money up for commuter rail. So I'm going to ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. And I ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. No other members have anything to add. The subcommittee stands adjourned.